welcome everybody to the ACDC World War III Roundtable. I'm your host, Mo from Mo's Game Table, and I'm joined by a bevy of design geniuses here for World War III games. We've got Bruce Maxwell, Fabrizio Vianello, Tony Morfitt, Adam Starkweather, and Mark Herman. So this is going to be a great chat with everybody here today. And if you have any questions or comments, post them in the chat. We'll share them with everybody here, and they can answer your questions directly. But welcome all to the Roundtable today. Appreciate you all joining us.
Glad to be here.
Glad to be here.
Hi, guys.
So we've got a lot of games amongst everybody here. And I know that Fabrizio, you were all excited before getting to meet Mark Herman finally, who was a big inspiration for you for your 1985 series. And I was, I think, tickled that his game, The Next Warhead, really inspired you that way.
Yeah. For me, we started playing the Next War, me, Marco Semmino, and a couple of other guys back in the 80s, and we were immediately we loved it. We really loved it, and we actually never stopped playing it. And I usually had the NATO side when we were playing. And despite the fact that I was actually never able to win a single time as NATO, probably I'm really a bad NATO player. I really love the game, and so after several decades, me and Marco Semmino decided that it would be fun to have a sort of update of the order of battle and of the system, and we started thinking an update focused on 1985. At the same time, I was keeping a blog describing with a quite detailed after-action report our latest campaign in the Next War. And we saw that the blog was having really a big success. There were a lot of people reading it. And so in the end, to keep it short, we decided to publish actually a new, updated, and revised version, if you wish, if you want, of the Next War. And this was the beginning of 1985. We had in mind since we started to have 3 chapters to cover the Scandinavian front and the Gulf front too. And it took 6 years, but I'm very, 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 very happy of the result. And I wish to thank again Mark for the inspiration he gave us during all these years, and for the inspiration to start the games in the end. That's it.
And we were going to have Yves Rattel was going to join us from VUCA Simulations. Unfortunately, he's not able to because he's stuck in a really bad situation right now. He's in the Galapagos on vacation, and he has no Wi-Fi, so he can't join us. But he wanted to be here as well because his game Red Strike is also influenced by Mark with his Aegean Strike and Gulf Strike games. So, Mark, you're having quite the impact. And what is it? How does that make you feel? Not only having those designs that are very well received years ago, and now it is inspiring the next generation of designers.
Homage.
Yes.
Well, I would offer that we all stand on the shoulders of others. So if we're going to talk about Next War, I have to. So obviously, I would like to talk about the only guy I call boss is James F. Dunnigan, who I had lunch with just 3 weeks ago. He's good, and Al Nofi, and. He came to me one day with this, and remember the whole this whole field of, NATO Warsaw Pact gaming started with Dunnigan when he did his original NATO game. Bruce did one at the same title later on. As it turns out, you can't trademark the word NATO because they already own it, so you can do other games on that title. So we did NATO. Jim did NATO, and then there was Red Star, White Star, and so he started that whole genre. And when I got to SPI, he wanted to do this monster, NATO Warsaw Pact game, which I spent the next 8 months. In fact, my wife mentioned it the other day because when this is summer of 1978, I was doing the editing, and Jim had gotten this crazy. He had this big Burroughs computer. So Burroughs computer in that day was like bigger than my car that ran all the SPI stuff, and he found out you could do word processing on it. So and you could only word process on it. You could only do one line at a time on the screen. It wasn't a screen like a monitor. It was just one little LED screen. And so I believe I'm the first person to develop a war game on a Burroughs computer word processor, one sentence at a time. And so I would change the word, and then I would hit return, and it would usually take about 15, 20 seconds to do the update per sentence. There's every single sentence in those rules. And I used to call my girlfriend then, who's I've been living with for the last 43 years. And in college, and I used to say, "Hey, I'm sitting here editing the rules at 3:00 in the morning. How are you doing?" I mean, so it was a painful. It was like giving birth to an elephant. It was very painful. but
I had similar experiences. Yeah,
I'm glad Fabrizio, because everybody goes to me. I get these notes, and I'm glad you did it. They used to say to me, "How come you don't do the order of battle's wrong? It doesn't have the right tanks." I said, "It was in 1978." I mean, they didn't even have the M1 tank then. And they would just bring in the MLRS system was like in prototype then. I mean, there's none of those systems that are there in the mid 80s didn't exist in the 78. So there's a big difference in the capabilities. And of course, after that, I got a job down in the Pentagon. And so I looked at the real stuff after that. And it was interesting to me what I learned. But in fact, I even wrote some various paragraphs in the Congressional Record for the NATO Warsaw Pact balance after this. So, like I said, the next war has been a huge boon in my career and my life, and I'm glad others enjoyed it so much. So, you're welcome. But really, Jim is really the guy you should be thanking, because it's really his idea to go in this direction, and I was just sort of the first of the many to follow, is the way I would look at it.
Yeah.
And then we have Adam here with his OSS and CSS system games for Doomsday, as well as the Modern War series that have started up now with Compass. And one of the things that I like is having series games. You have a same set of rules. You have that rule system within each series, and it makes it, I think, easier for you when you play that first game. You get over that initial hump, then you can just move from game to game, just learning any of the additional chrome that's added from there. What are your thoughts? What were your inspirations when you came up with that, both of those series for covering this topic?
Well, I'll also talk to Next War. Next War was my favorite game on the topic. In fact, I pulled out Next War a couple of years ago to play it, and I will say it's the only game that I pulled out that I don't have to read the rules to. I mean, you play thousands of games, and I always have to read the rules to refresh, but not a Next War. And Fabrizio, you may not know this, but about, 12, 13 years ago, I talked to MMP about doing what you did for Under an Iron Sky, of redoing Next War and, updating it and all that stuff. And back then, there was not much interest in the topic, or at least we didn't know there was any interest in the topic. So we never made it, and that became Doomsday later. It's called Doomsday back then too, but it's I think the trailblazer for introducing this topic is Mark Herman, or reintroducing the topic is not Mark Herman, Mark Walker, who put out some stuff, and it really shot up and people loved it. So, but like 12 years ago, we didn't know it would be popular. Whether because who would play it that's not 60 years old that lived through it.
True.
Now that 20, it's like fantasy.
That goes to the next question, which is, why now do you think there is this resurgence in an interest in hypothetical, in a war that never happened, hypothetical World War III, and it always seems to be centered around the 80s. Just like Mark was saying before, things changed after the 70s. The U.S. really started to build up with Reagan, and the U.S. then became a juggernaut at that point. Prior to that, it would have been a much different story. What do you think the resurgence now in interest, being designers, what inspired you to jump into these games now? And why do you think there's such an interest for the gamers themselves, and why are they really a hot ticket right now to buy?
Fabrizio, why don't you take that one?
Okay. Actually, I think that, of course, one of the first element is probably nostalgia for the period, for our youth years, and so on. The second point is probably that is a conflict that has never been fought, and it's something I think that everybody, what at least me for sure, I will really like to know how you hold that gun. Not that I want a World War III, but it's something it's like watching the first part of a thriller movie and not being able to see the second part, and so you're there just watching to discover who the killer is or who the culprit is, and you'll never know. And it's so if you have a chance sometime, even only with a game, to know or to imagine which side would have won, it's something really interesting for me. So I think this was a key element in the resurgence of World War III games. I don't know if Anthony has something to add about this matter.
I mean, I think I would add possibly 2 points. One is I do agree, and there was just a note up that there's a degree of nostalgia for the 80s, and you see it across the piece, and whether that is from music, it's all the way through into wargaming as well. There is a bunch of older guys, a lot of people who served at the time want to get back in, and if you look at it, it is quite close historically. It's a bit like when we sat in the 70s and the 80s, then it was World War II and what our fathers had done, or perhaps grandfathers in some cases. But by now, we're looking back at unfinished business. But I think also with that is the fact that is that unfinished business coming back again? Because it's as if it was parked through the 1990s. You had the peace dividend in Western Europe, and you had the collapse of the Soviet Union, and more particularly, you had the internal collapse of Russia under Yeltsin's regime. And then we've had the last 20 years of whatever we've had over the last 20 years, without making this overly political. You get to the stage where we are sat today with whatever may or may not be happening on the Ukrainian border. And it puts the thing potentially back into perspective. It brings the whole East-West conflict, or the European East-West conflict, back into perspective again, which is not forgetting everything else. The other thing I would add is that the other part of that question was why the 1980s? Well, I think why the 1980s is probably because it was in the post-war world, that Cold War world, without a doubt. If you expand the decade a little bit, take it back to 77 or 76, it is the most, until the end in 89, it was the most dynamic period. I believe it's the most dynamic period. Certainly as far as quote unquote conventional war is concerned. In that, up until the NATO track decisions of 1978 or so, then all of us, everybody was sat in Europe, be it the US Army, be it the British Army, be it anybody else. It's actually just a tripwire of waiting for it to go nuclear one way or the other. Nobody actually expected to fight a conventional war in Europe in any time and win, I don't believe. And then you start to see that change, a change in attitude. There's a change in attitude in America, there's a change in attitude in the UK, and there is a forced change of strategy, which the Germans forced through in 77, 78 in order to allow Pershing to be deployed. You will fight to defend Germany properly. And you then see the whole thing through the 80s get kit, but you also get intellectual concept, thought, whether it is in America with Army of Excellence, air-land battle, whether it is in the UK, and people like Bagnall and Farndale looking at getting operational maneuverability back into NATO, and not just sitting in a layer cake waiting to get squashed before you could throw the big buckets of sunshine one way or another.
Hey, Patrick, I got to talk to you real quick here. Patrick from VUCA Simulations, he's joining us, and he's saying thanks for taking the time here to talk about this topic. You got to talk to your guy Eves there, man. He shouldn't have been in the Galapagos. He should have been here. I'm just making a joke. Enjoy his vacation. But Bruce, now that
you're lucky man.
Yeah. Bruce, now that you've had a chance to take a breather after running a 4-player NATO game earlier this morning and then jumping right into this and trying to scarf down a quick lunch, your thoughts here on the resurgence of World War III games and how that is anything that these other guys have not already covered.
I really agree with the points that have been made already. I think the fact that a lot of us are hitting retirement age and have time, it adds a little factor to the nostalgia. But I think the points that Tony and Fabrizio made are just right on target. I don't really have anything to add.
Well,
Someone's saying that Adams kids are loud. They must be Mets fans.
Well, one isn't. But one's a
You
Cardinals
let him
fan.
live with you? How could you let him live with you? He's not a Mets fan. What the hell?
Oh, I lost the daughter. My wife's a Cardinals fan, so she went the other way.
Mm.
But I'll throw my 2 cents in because I've actually given some thought to this. My own feeling is twofold. One of which is that while it's not part of history, a dynamic conflict between the Pact and NATO, it is part of wargaming history. That we all played these games in the 70s and 80s. And it was very much a part of our world. I played NATO, Red Star, White Star, Mech War 2, Mark's game, Next War. And it was where SPI was also like doing new mechanics. They were trying out new stuff. And it was sort of their breeding ground. So I played a ton of it back in the 70s and 80s. And it's part of my history in the hobby. And the intimacy of that. So I think for the older guys, that's for us, that it's sort of replaying our history. So it has validity as an event that actually happened in our little cardboard world. And then the other reason I think is that it's the last chance to have like World War II in World War III. We have 2 even sides, this mechanized kind of thing. It's going to be about encirclements and moving fast and all that. It's not, it's not this monopolar power structure anymore. What it is now. So I also think you can refight World War II, and that's what all the games do. I'm not sure the games actually capture what would really have happened, which, all the nukes flying and all that stuff. We tend to shy away from that. But we sure do like to play the World War II kind of battle in World War III. So I think it's sort of a mix of those. You can play World War II with M1s and T-80s and all that stuff. And it's part of our history. It's part of wargaming nostalgia. We all played these battles. We were all on the cardboard battles, and it's part of our history, if not real history.
By the way,
good point.
I remember just a little episode when I was in the Italian army. I was on guard one night, and I brought NATO with me. And so I just made all the setup for NATO and so on. And when I was more or less in the middle of the game, the captain entered in the office and look at the map and told me, "Oh, what's that? Oh, okay. What are you doing?" I tried to explain. I tried to briefly explain the rules. To my dismay, after maybe 10, 15 minutes, he just said, "Oh no, it's too complicated. It's not for me." Okay, just go on. But I had a lot of fun with Bruce NATO too. It was one of my favorites.
That's true. And like you were saying, Adam, it's a continuation of World War II. It's like advanced World War II is what it is. You have clearly defined sides. You have better technology. You get to see how all of these platforms will work, or at least how you would think they would work based on what the designer, how they add that into the game, how they put it in the game. And of course, you also have to deal with designer bias as well as designer, the knowledge they have, whatever information they're using on. What do you think, all of you, how do you think that plays into not just the World War III games, but World War II games as well, we see it. But in World War III, because it's all hypothetical, how do you think designer bias, as well as the information they use, how that can really change things up?
A lot.
I have a strong opinion about that, in that there was a meme that the U.S. Army put out that our adversaries were idiots. And I think it's just natural to be chauvinistic no matter what culture or society that you're in. But my own perspective was that the Soviets were not idiots. They were very good at the art of studying things and planning for them. That was a distinct Soviet strength. What people miss is that the Soviet system was geared to work for the limitations and the strengths of Soviet society, Soviet industry, and the Soviet approach to fighting war. And their system worked very well for what they had to work with. And so my own perspective is that there's far too much bias in NATO Warsaw Pact games about the superiority of NATO's forces, NATO's command structure, NATO's doctrine. I don't believe it. I think that if the balloon had gone up, the Soviets would have fought extremely well with their style of warfare. And the interesting things would have been how those two asymmetries would have played out.
I would like to respectfully have another position on that.
Go for it.
The Russians had a very well. It's true, they studied the heck out of the war and World War II in particular. I mean, there's tons of papers that I read in the day on those topics about how they looked at the war and how they translated it into it. And I think that the Soviets were planning on fighting another version of World War II that would not have worked. It might have worked at various points, but it probably wouldn't have worked from the late 70s on. And the big problem wasn't that they had, tanks and people and who knew, basically knew their craft, but because of their society at the time and their command structure would not have held up very well to what we were going to go do to it when they came coming. And once that you fragment that top-down control system, I don't know that it would have worked so well. I mean, they would have been good on the defense. They would have been very tough, brave people and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that. Their ability to coordinate beyond the initial shock would have been very limited. And what we would have done to it, I don't think it would have worked very well. And we also, I would say that inside the building for many years, they overestimated significantly the training levels of the Category 3 and Category 2 divisions, such that they didn't have as many, and also the reliability of the Warsaw Pact allies, I think, was way overstated, even in their own minds.
Absolutely.
These Germans, maybe the Bulgarians, but the Poles and the Romanians would have been not very steady for them for a lot of reasons. And so I don't know that I agree with it. In fact, I'll tell a true story. When I got to the Pentagon in 1979, one of the first things they asked me to do was to look at a set of Soviet war game rules that they use in their military and tell me what did I think about what they thought about it. And what was interesting is when you look at the other guy, what did they value on, like if you look at, like, if you had a bunch of pieces and you rated them, how would the Soviets rate their own pieces and our pieces? And at that time, the Mi-24 Hind helicopter was just coming online, and they thought a lot about, they really thought helicopters were a big deal in those war game rules. And they were like armored flying tanks, the way they used them and in the rules. And so they had a perspective that they realized that those tanks were very vulnerable to what we would have done to them. Again, massed armor in an age of submunitions and electronic warfare might not have worked as well as they would like. But on the other hand, it was an army in being. There's no question that they had political leverage from all of those forces, but I don't think that they ever had a serious view that they could launch an attack and succeed, because their lines of communication back to the Soviet Union were horribly vulnerable to anything beyond what they could forward store. And like I said, you know, it was well understood what we had to do to stop them. And I think we would have, it would have been a horrendous situation. Thankfully, it never happened, but I don't think they were as good. And I think they knew they weren't as good as they claimed to be themselves. That's my view.
Tony, you were just itching to get into this.
I think some interest point to add to what Mark just said, because I recently found a document that was obtained by CIA in the 80s, and it was originally a Soviet document, and that is titled, in a typical Soviet fashion, the title is Combat Potential on the Armament of the Ground Forces and Aviation of the USSR and of the Armies of a Probable Enemy. That's the title. And the document contains a series of tables that comparing specific weapon type systems and giving to each weapon system a military value. The point here is not the exactness or the precision of the single military value evaluation, but the overall evaluation of the Soviet strength that emerged. For example, the last generation tanks of the period are almost all rated at a value much higher than the equivalent Soviet tank, with the only exception of the improved T-80. I don't know what they mean for improved here, but anyway, that's only exception. Another interesting point is that NATO's anti-air systems, the top-notch anti-air systems, are on average rated 2 or 3 times higher as military value than their Soviet counterpart. And finally, aircraft like the F-15, F-16, or F-14 are rated as 3 times more effective than the MiG-23 and 6 times more effective than the MiG-21 latest version. So I think that this gives quite a realistic view of what the Soviets thought were their real possibilities in a direct conflict with NATO. They perfectly knew their weaknesses. They perfectly knew their strength point, and they perfectly knew that they were probably inferior in a vast array of very important weapon systems on the battlefield.
Tony, I know you wanted to join in as well.
No, I don't mean to be quiet. I think I would add 2 or 3 points. First one, which actually I think is applicable to World War II as well as World War III, and games design in World War II as well as World War III, is that there is a tendency to get excited about kit rather than about people. So X tank is 4 times better than Y tank, and therefore X tank will always kill at least 4 Y tanks before it can be lost. Well, that sort of goes against everything that happened between 1940 and 1942 as far as the Germans are concerned in taking on everybody, from us, the French, the Russians, or anybody else they fought, with generally technically inferior, but actually better procedures. Leaving that to one side, I think that carries through, and that because we got so excited in World War II, reality as societies in America, in the UK, that fetish about kit has carried on ever since, and it's certainly carried on into the Cold War, and then reflected in gaming design and games design.
So what you're saying is that the modern M1 is pretty much the King Tiger and the Tiger of World War II.
I am and I'm not. Is there? It is not so much the fact that you have. It's not so much the fact that the M1 is intrinsically better than a T80.
No, I mean just
Whether the people
the
can
fascination
use
with
it
it.
in a cleverer way than people were using the T80. And then you have to ask yourself that in a battlefield that became, if we take the Central Front, from the Elbe to the Alps, and that the weapon density that you had, I found there was an interesting paper written by Dr. Paddy Griffiths in, when was it, 78, 79. And his prognosis in 78, 79 was that World War III would stop and then end up as some kind of World War I equivalent. When we ran out of the munitions and the spare parts for all the tanks and all the metal, or the metal got shot to bits, and it was just you left with the people on the ground who dug holes in the ground.
Be done
So
with sticks and stones at that point.
And whatever it is you're on for, assuming that you hadn't been throwing big buckets of sunshine at it by that stage. So I think that therefore it comes down to how resilient you are. And I think where I would perhaps have a slightly different view than Mark is that my belief is that the USSR, or the Russian forces, if you like, within that, Soviet forces, would have been more resilient to losing command and control systems than any NATO state that I have seen, and particularly the UK and the US. I have been an electronic warfare officer, and again, true story, I've been on an exercise where we have jammed, and I have had brigade commanders ring us up and say, turn the jamming off, I cannot work in this environment. Because it was quote unquote spoiling the exercise for the rest of the troops. And there is a degree of that, so we went away again. And that was that, and then they were left to get on. We had both the US, the UK, the Germans, the Dutch, all of them. If you look at their tactical communication systems, there's very little resilience left in them by the mid-80s. There is some really fantastic state-of-the-art, point-to-point radio relay, tele-type, first computers, VHF, secure, etc. But by which time, when you turn around to staff officers and say, okay, I want you to transmit that order that you're now sending from 5 Corps to whatever division, but you have to send it at high speed, hand speed Morse. How do you get that? How do you get that order over where you have to write it on a message pad, hand it to a signaler who's going to sit there and tap a key, and somebody at the other end is going to write down what they hear and hand it to another staff officer, and then you're going to get this great wide flanking maneuver by, coordinated with, doing this, that, and the other. I think we had much less resilience in terms of procedures than they had. Or they were, because their procedures were, because they worked to a plan. And once the plan was given, we always said, well, they can't change it, so that's a problem. The fact that you can't change it is perhaps not a problem if you can't make the changes and nobody can react to changes. That's, I think, what I would say to that. So I think there is, of course, in the end, it comes down to the whole question of morale, ability to fight the war, ability to sustain the war if it started. And I think where Mark is absolutely right is that the Soviet Union's appetite for the thing dropped off exponentially starting from about 75, when they were probably at the apogee, as was the East Germany, as were the rest, and fell away to 1992 when it was all wrapped up and we all, everybody went home. So, and at that stage, we in the West were were having the reverse effect was happening. America was getting over Vietnam and coming back up and living the great, boost through Reagan. We were living the boost through Thatcher, this, that, and the other. If you look at 1985, the position where we have our game set, and you look at the political leadership of every NATO country, with the exception almost of Italy, and I have apologized to Fabrizio on many occasions, except of Italy, which has got a weak, vacillating left-wing government, just about every other government in NATO is a relatively conservative, strong leadership, dynamic leadership, and probably better able to hold the course. That would be my view on it.
Well, I want to just throw out here that we've now coined a new phrase, throwing big buckets of sunshine when it comes to tossing nukes in a game. And that's going to live on forever. That's a great one. I love that one, Tony.
If I can, Mo,
Yeah.
I think my game actually is most impacted by this concept, where I wanted it to take place in '85, so because I wanted the kit, I wanted the fun stuff, your F-15s and 16s and M1s and M2s and all that, MiG-29s and T-80s. But my problem was that as I looked in it both from a Soviet doctrine perspective as well as a force perspective, I didn't think the Soviets had a chance at all. They were racked by Afghanistan, and it would be like the Russians attacking in '76. So my problem was that I couldn't do what you standardly do in a war game, which is history is all the same until the day you meet the first counter. I went back to Brezhnev's death and changed history. I gave the Soviets, young people, because at least as I remember it, we were always scared when those leaders would die that someone who had never experienced war would take over in Russia and would be much more aggressive. So I had those young guys take over, and I gave them 3 years to modernize 5 years, I guess, 4 years, to modernize their equipment. So get those second line divisions, category Bs ready, upgrade their planes and all that stuff. And I had a whole plan in which they take NATO completely by strategic surprise, because without those, and I also had to change the doctrine, because fighting World War III in 1985 at least, without nukes flying right away, including Los Angeles, New York, and Moscow, and all that, is sort of like World War I without a Schlieffen plan. Mm-hmm. I just didn't see it as a possibility. So I had to dynamically change the history going in, so that the Russians could get surprised, they'd have a shot, and modernize their equipment somewhat, get those category Bs, recover from the devastation of Afghanistan, which hurt them, if not more so than Vietnam hurt us, at least equivalent. They were in no shape to fight in '85. So, so I actually created an entire alternate reality in Doomsday. So I guess I've been the most biased of all of them, if you call it that. But
you need to have that. You need to have that to have some sort of basis for having the to posit the theory you're giving in your game. And then the next question I had, which I wanted to start with you, Adam, was what are the unique challenges of designing modern games? Modern warfare, especially like World War III here that we're talking about. You are in a kind of a unique situation, just like Fabrizio and Tony, in that you have series games. Bruce is also doing that now with Air and Armor, which will be coming out. That will also become a series, but with OSS and CSS, you have two different series. Fabrizio has the 1985 series, C3 series. What are the unique challenges there in creating those games and reflecting the modern warfare in compared to doing a World War II game or an ACW game, because you've done all these different types of games? What unique challenges are there for you here? And then we'll go around the horn.
Well, I'm not sure it's a unique challenge, but it is a different kind of experience doing World War III games. Partly, I think a lot has to do with that the people buying them are the people that were actually there. So they're much more in a frame of mind in which what they think will happen. But in addition, not only are you talking with people that were actually there and you're evaluating them, you're giving them quantitative evaluation based on them, but also you're fighting the nostalgia as well. So the nostalgia is getting them to buy it. And for me, with Compass coming out with Bruce's game and Third World War, I wanted to do something really different, so I gave them an alternative. So I threw all these kind of weird rules and weird kind of mechanisms in there. So you get something different. You get a different appreciation of what it is. But, you're fighting the nostalgia of the joys that people had playing Bruce's game, that they get it again. or Third World War, or Next War with Fabrizio. You're fighting that joy that they had when I was, 18 and 16 and 12 playing NATO, Red Star, White Star, Mech War 2 and all that. So it gets them to buy it, but you're also fighting their perceptions. So it's certainly a big challenge of what they think versus what you think. And of course, it's hypothetical. So there is no informed opinion here. There's no storyboard to base it on.
Bruce?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that question in a slightly different framework, which is not so much World War III in specific, but designing modern war games. There are a couple of things that I think are distinct about that design challenge that somebody doing a World War II game doesn't have to bother with. Let's just begin with the fact that you have to pick your setting. And so you've got to make a whole series of assumptions about something that hasn't happened yet. If you're going to do a Middle East conflict the way Fabrizio did, where in the Middle East? What are you going to highlight, and why are you going to highlight that? The second thing that becomes a challenge is the order of battle. We don't have historians who have poured through the archives to pull out a lot of information. We do, of course, now about World War III in the 80s, but if you're trying to do a war game on what would happen if the Russians attacked the Ukraine, or what would happen if the Chinese attacked Taiwan, now you've got to come up with an order of battle, and that information is quite difficult to get at. The third thing is that you really don't know what the performance of these various weapon systems are going to be, and in a combined arms element, you don't know how well they're going to perform. If we look at truly modern warfare, the next dimension that is beginning to be layered on are unmanned, armed drones. And as the Turks demonstrated with their sales to the Azerbaijanis, turns out that those weapons are actually surprisingly effective. And if a Turkish armed drone can win a war, what would an American armed drone or a Russian armed drone do? So there are a lot of questions that you can't really answer in terms of how effective is this brand new weapon system going to be. I think another completely different element becomes a unique challenge for modern war game design. We all know that if the Germans take Paris in 1940, well, they've won. What does victory look like in a modern war game? What is it that you're going to say is going to be the objective, and how do you know that you have won that conflict? And so a modern wargamer designer has to make a whole series of interrelated assumptions and guesstimates that pose a much larger challenge than somebody who gets to work within a historical framework. I'll stop there.
True. Mark? You can tear yourself away from that football game for a moment.
No, actually, I'm looking at us.
You were looking at, I thought you were, because you said you had the football game on too.
Well, the football game's up there. Tampa Bay is beating up.
Don't tell me. I'm going to watch later.
But the chat feed is over here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway, I want to pick up on something that Bruce just said. I think is right, is you don't know how these things actually are going to work. And I take Tony's point. I think it's really as much about the people, and where I'll respectfully disagree. I understand that at the staff level, cutting off from a unit, but I put my money on a NATO company figuring out what to do when they had to do it without anybody telling them what to do, better than a Soviet one would do it. And that's just how I look at it. And I've seen them do it in just look at Afghanistan. There's plenty of data to show how how things are. The reality is that the American Army in the mid 80s was probably one of the best trained armies in the world at that time. And I think the same could be said for the British and the Germans and all that. And I think the Soviets knew that. I don't think that they thought they were getting to Paris anytime too soon. So I don't think that victory condition is not a problem. But what I like about what you were talking about, Bruce, is not knowing how well the weapon system. So I'll give So if you go back to the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, which predates my time at SPI, but it was about the time that a lot of games were coming out on it. The original reports were that these Sagar-1 missiles were really effective at knocking out tanks. As it turns out, that wasn't even true. They were good, but they were easily suppressed. It was the RPG-7s that were really effective, and the hunter-killer teams. Again, so the first reports that come out from the field in a contemporary sense are usually inaccurate. And by the time they get accurate, so when you're doing a modern, I don't want to use the word modern, when you're doing a game, a contemporaneous design, in other words, you're designing a game about the time you're living in, so you don't have any history. So again, now, Next War, 1978, that's ancient history. Even 1985 is ancient history. That's 35 years ago. And so getting an order of battle, so that's like a history game at this point of a what if scenario. But when Jim and I and were doing the Next War, we were literally pulling stuff out of the newspapers. We were extrapolating from the Arab-Israeli wars, which was the only real touchstone on how these systems worked. How good the effectiveness of the SA, the ineffectiveness of the SA2, but the effectiveness of the SA6 was a big deal in that period of time. So again, we were trying to figure out where the, as Tony calls it, the kit works, right? How does the kit work? But it's also the training level of the units. And we were also trying to capture the doctrine. So when you're designing a modern game, you're trying to capture what you think is the doctrine. And so, so Jim had come up with this continuous movement combat system where you're paying movement points for everything. You can fatigue units and all that kind of stuff. And then I brought in the breakthrough zones that made it all work. It didn't work until you put the breakthrough zones in. Otherwise, things got all muddled up mechanically. And so once we sorted that all out, we had a model of what we thought would happen in a high intensity, situation like that, and that you could burn units out literally, which was the human element was the fatigue factor and the fact that the equipment's breaking down and all that. And so I think that when you're dealing with the here and now, the difficulty is, how good, let's just talk about if the US and the the Chinese, rattled around in the South trying to see against each other, what's going to happen? The main thing I know is going to happen is all those forward deployed units will run out of ammunition in about 24 to 36 hours. Then after that, they're out of bullets. So they're going to pull back. And so what you're going to see in a lot of these modern situations is going to be sort of this rapid, high intensity, exchange based on a lot of factors. And then they run out of torpedoes and anti-ship missiles and anti-missiles and all this kind of jam. And then they're going to run out of bullets and they all back off. Well, we'll have to back off because they live there. And so it's very hard. And so any conflict is a long, engaged affair. And if you go back to the NATO situation we're talking about, there was this term called POMKIS. I guess everybody knows what that is by now. But those prepositioned configured unit sets were laying all over Germany at Ramstein and that basic area and then we had to bring in most of NATO was designed to do anti-shipping missile, mine clearing so we could get the transport ships into the ports of Antwerp and such. And so there was a whole war overlay of who gets to, the initial part of the party is understood, but who gets to the party on the first month and the 8th month and all that. That's really where you have to start to look at these things. Because again, everybody gets excited about the initial hit. But once that's over, you're talking about, industrial societies that can generate, these are $1 trillion economies that can generate equipment and things, at great cost, but almost indefinitely, unless you start attacking homelands and electronic warfare and all this kind of jazz. So modern games, I think, are interesting more at the strategic level than they are at the tactical level. But of course, that's what everybody likes is to roll tanks around and shoot each other.
Great points. It's almost like a boxing match at that point. You only have so much to go 3 minutes, and then you have to stop. You run out of ammo, and then you're going to have to, at least for the forward deployed, like you were saying, and then they'd have to get a better supply line. in place, but also the units that are there are still going to run into a similar sort of supply issue, even though they've got a shorter distance to get there. Like the Chinese would have a shorter distance, they would still run into the same type of situation with running out of ammunition, because these weapons platforms today are so, they use up ammo so fast.
If you just look at World War II very quickly, we didn't understand Japanese night fighting capability and their torpedoes and those kind of things, and they were not as invested in radar that we had really put the money into. So everybody had this asymmetry of capabilities, and when you put them together initially, the Zero came off better than what we had, but we held on okay. The Wildcat, dealt with the Zero as best it could, and they came up better tactics and all that, and the torpedoes were always a problem, but again. Radar gave us the gunnery, range advantage eventually once we figured out how to get the commanders to trust it, but it was a whole process going on there. And so all the surprises, just like in the Arab-Israeli war, the RPG-7 and the SA-6 were the surprises. And and every war has its surprises. Something works much better than you think, or it doesn't work even half as, most of the anti-tank weapons that even in today's world, they have like a 1 in 5 chance of hitting anything. In the Vietnam War, all those Sparrow and missiles, they were firing sometimes 4 or 5 missiles just to get one to stay to work and hit something. So, there's a lot of reliability issues. I mean, when you really get down into the noise of it, the area is very fascinated with the technology, but believe me, a lot of the technology doesn't work right away, or doesn't work as well as you think it is. And there's a couple of surprises that work a lot better than you thought. And it's just, that's really the more interesting part for me, is in a contemporary game, how's that going to play? And also in a contemporary game, logistics is far more important than is usually given stock in most games.
True. And here's a question here. Somebody was asking about standing aside the light your map on fire sort of nuclear rules in a game. Is nuclear war really ungameable in these World War III games? And everybody's thoughts on that, as far as how you think, from what you've seen in games and what your thoughts are as a designer. Is it really gameable? And if so, how? And if it's not gameable, why?
If I can add something to the challenges of designing modern warfare discussion, I completely agree with what has been said until now. But another challenge for me, at least, has been the speed of changes in the order of battle and of practically every nation. I mean, I make a point usually of having a very exact, precise order of battle. So if you're trying to create an order of battle set in, for example, June 8, 1985, you have a lot of documents that are no more valid. You have to find out more documents updated for that date. You find out that some units have already changed or upgraded part of their equipment and not the rest of equipment. And so it's really quite complicated. And if you just shift your design 1 year or 2 years later, everything has changed already. So it's actually quite a challenge to get the order of battle right, correct, and exact. It's been a mess.
So now onto the topic of nuclear warfare, gaming that. Is it gameable, ungameable, if you're going to have it as part of a World War III game, not just because there are some games that are just about nuclear warfare or the leading up to getting up to the brink of it, and then whether it happens or not. But adding it in as a part of a just standard World War III game, is that really gameable or ungameable? Your thoughts. We'll start with Tony first.
I mean, principally,
since you like to throw buckets of sunshine, I thought you'd be the first one.
But it exactly is the point about buckets of sunshine. I think whatever you do with nuclear warfare is it's got the initiation of it can be a conscious, even a rational decision, but the rules must then allow it to spiral out of control in ways that you would not have expected it to. And it doesn't matter if that's, player versus player. It shouldn't be just out to them. There's got to be a whole host of, in my view, a whole host of chances of it going in directions that you did not want it to do so. Because I think, and I spent the first 20 years of my career in the army, every exam we took had great things about, about nuclear warfare, about, learning the various strategies, about bringing up stuff left, right, and center, and whether you could do escalation, etc., etc. I don't think I ever really believed that once you started escalating, you could retain control of it. I know it's in every book, and from Hackett onwards, they bomb Birmingham, we throw one at Minsk, everybody stops, or they fire, or we fire three, but at isolated headquarters, they fire three TAC nukes back, and then Reagan and Brezhnev are on the phone to each other saying, right, let's stop, that's all got to be. Don't believe it for an instant. I really don't believe it for an instant. I'm not quite setting fire to games. That's a bit of an over-the-top reaction, but I think you should be allowed to throw the dice because those dice did exist. But if you do, then you need to be prepared for consequences that perhaps you didn't want to have, would be my view.
Adam?
Well, I certainly think it's gameable. It just changes the game a little bit. And I plan to put out a doomsday thing on nuclear war. But I do think that you sort of have to change the framework. You have to change the dynamic of what's going on and who do the players actually represent. So for me, I did theater commanders, but I had the strategic side, the president and the Politburo chairman weren't interested in nuclear war. So you're the theater commander. You actually have to request weapons. You lose victory points for requesting, and you ask for them. And if you don't get them, it makes it less likely you'll get them again, and it goes down. So it's a declining value resource. So be careful about asking for them, and that's the point.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think gamers, by and large, don't like playing with them. I'm not sure why. It always felt in the old SBI games that nuclear war was an afterthought. It was sort of a grafted on thing at the end, not like an integral part of the game, like Bruce Costello's stuff that was brought up. So I think
or Ty Bomba, who Ty will throw nukes in a Napoleonic game if he can.
Yeah, I haven't played his modern stuff.
Ty loves his mushroom clouds.
But most gamers, I think, don't like. I mean, watching people play my games, they're not using the nuke rules. Don't actually use the chemical rules very often. So I think that's part of it. The gamers aren't really into that. Maybe it's a moral trip. I don't know.
Well, to interject here just real quick, that is a really great point you're bringing up, because that actually adds to, or lends itself to the deterrence of nuclear weapons in the real world. I know you have that capability. I have that capability. Who wants to take that first step? No one really does, because they know the aftermath. They know what is going to happen. It can escalate. Like Tony was saying, it can go in ways that you don't expect once you let that genie out of the bottle.
And gamers sort of act the same way about it.
Well, if I could, so this is a real. So in 1989, maybe 1988, I was part of I was working at NATO, and we were in a big what they call a CHODS, chief of delegation exercise, and it's the last night of the exercise. So I've been up for days, and I had built this model called the theater analysis model that they use for combat adjudication for this NATO war. It was think about Gulf Strike on steroids, And it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden, General Gavin, who was the SACEUR, in a crisp 4-star uniform, looked like he just woke up and had his aide give him his uniform at 3 o'clock in the morning. And he says to me, listen, NATO was holding rather well. He said, if there isn't a big breakthrough, I can't have the nuclear release discussion. Do you understand what I'm saying? I said, I absolutely do, sir. So I went down to the bottom of the model and turned all the levers differently. And there was a breakthrough. And the next day, the Chads talked about nuclear release, which is what they do. So the nuclear discussion is a big deal in these things, because it is we're not going to let them. There was no situation. That was the other problem the Soviets were going to run into, is effectively there was no situation where we were going to cede Western Europe to the Soviets. I mean, it just wasn't going to happen. And the old thing, would we trade Bonn for Washington? I think the answer is probably yes, maybe, in that situation. If they were really gone that sideways, anything was possible. But they were definitely practicing how to do all that stuff. And the Soviets were, I'm sure, the Soviets were getting their own little secret agent types telling them what was going on and all that crap. So I think that the deterrence of nuclear warfare was legitimate, but if somebody really thought that invading, Western Germany, Federal Republic of Germany at that time was going to be a free ride, was just, smoking something. That said, nuclear weapons, I think Tony said it well, once the first one goes off, all the rules change. And the safest place actually in a nuclear war is probably going to be as close to the Soviet front line as you can get. Is probably the safest place to be, because it's the only place they won't shoot a nuclear weapon probably at that point. But, if you're just I saw a bunch of comments about the Scud missiles and Patriots. It's notable that in the Gulf War, the American unit that took the highest casualties was a Pennsylvania water purification unit from the National Guard that got hit. Their barracks got hit by a Scud missile. And those poor guys were the highest casualty unit in the war. The safest place to be was in an M1 tank attacking the Republican Guard, was safer than sitting in a barracks back in Kuwait, or wherever the heck their barracks was. And so the point is that the nuclear warfare is going to be more impactful to the rear areas. The logistics piece of it is where the nuclear weapons are going to go off. They're not going to be launching them necessarily right on the front lines to blow holes through the enemy front lines, because your guys are there, and then you have to drive through radioactive terrain, which is, you drop a nuclear weapon, it's not that easy to drive forward after that. It's not like everybody just it's like a billiard table. It's going to be a burning, smoking hell. You can't take troops through that necessarily for a while, so you're not going to drop them there unless you're really desperate. And so it would be really an escalation of the war way beyond, tanks shooting at each other in the Fulda Gap. So can be gamed, of course, but I think Bruce may have said it. The whole rules of the game change. Or Adam said it. The whole game change. It's a different game at that point. So it's not that you can't game it. It's just I don't think you can game it in the context of what you're looking at, other than as an overlay, as it were.
Yeah, Bruce.
Yeah, I have some strong feelings about this. Firstly, I agree strongly with the poster who said the threat of nuclear weapons has to be something that's modeled. I really didn't want to put nuclear weapons in NATO, because I agree with everything that's been said so far, that it's a different game. And I'll get to just how different in a second. But the players themselves said, Bruce, that's not realistic. That threat was there. You have to model the threat and the impact that threat had. And I think that modeling modern, or well, at least a World War III game without that threat is going to produce a pretty unrealistic simulation. So let's go with, there needs to be some mechanic that recognizes that there was always that lever that could be thrown. The second thing that I want to say is that I got my hands on a secret CIA analysis of a Soviet first strike that didn't use a single ICBM. And the concept of this analysis was that the Soviets would use tactical and intermediate range missiles and artillery, and they would keep their ICBMs essentially as the checkmate option. So we're going to incinerate Western Europe, but Mr. US, you don't want to launch your ICBMs into Russia because we'll counter. Whether that would have worked or not is a whole nother matter, but that study showed that the Soviets could throw 1,000 tactical and intermediate range warheads on the front line itself and another 2,000 in theater. And I just want to point out that that's enough to target NATO down to the company level. So when a first strike, and of course that means you're holding weapons in reserve, but when you do a first strike, you release 3,000 nuclear weapons in theater. What the bleep is left to fight over? So for me, I think it is ungameable once it goes off, because effectively everything that you had in your game is gone and you're starting with a whole new game. If I were to simulate what nuclear war was really going to look like, it would involve furs, it would involve flaking flints, it would involve the mechanics of trying to open a tin can with a rock, because that's where civilization would have gone. So I'm left unconvinced that you really can game that. The final thing that I'd like to throw into this conversation was that I had a conversation with the nuclear weapons officer for 7th Army during the 80s. And so that was a very interesting conversation. And he shared this insight, which made a lot of sense to me. He said, Bruce, we had absolutely no intention of launching nukes anywhere near our own people, to Mark's point. What we were going to do, we were going to drop air bursts over the Thurungerwald. And the idea was we were going to make the entire sector of our front impassable to the Soviets. It would have taken them weeks to cut their way through those roads. The second thing that we were going to do is we were going to use our nukes to drop every single river over the Elbe, the Oder, and the Vistula. Sorry, bridges. We were going to get all the railroad bridges. And to Mark's point about how vulnerable those links were, this would not have been generally targeting population centers at all. The bridges go down. How the hell are you getting fuel from the Caucasus 2,000 miles over that bombed out rail network without a rail bridge? I mean, it just wouldn't have been practical. And so I thought that the US nuclear war plans held out the possibility of a small number of tactical nuclear warheads that wouldn't necessarily have triggered Armageddon, but would have ended the war very quickly.
Yeah, those are great points. Like you're saying, if you're going to hit areas that are going to control the supply for the enemy, then that is going to have an even bigger impact than it would be if you went and tried nuking everything. So there would be a better use of them in that regard. But we did have another question here. We're talking about special operation forces here.
May I add something to the nuclear warfare question? Okay. Basically, I agree with the point that you cannot make a game about World War III without having nuclear rules or the possibility of nuclear warfare. And I also agree with Tony said before that you had to include some mechanism to have a situation, if you start using nuclear weapons, to have a situation going completely out of control. This is a good system for avoiding the players using the nuclear weapons without thinking about it. And it's probably also a good way to simulate what would have happened in reality. And the second thing that I wanted to say that I've also heard what Bruce was saying about the plans for bombarding, for nuke bombardment of the forested areas in the rear areas of Warsaw Pact. And I think it would have been probably quite effective because the roads will be completely littered by trees, debris, and so on, making whole columns of hundreds of trucks blocked right on the highway, and making them perfect sitting ducks for any airstrikes, incoming airstrike. So it would probably work very well. Regarding the opinion about the nuclear war, I think that it's quite interesting because it's one of the most debated things about World War III, of course. And there are, I think, three school of thought. The first one is the school of thought that thinks that the Soviet planned for immediate nuclear warfare. And this is based on the well-known Warsaw Pact plans, mostly from the 70s, starting with a nuclear carpet bombing on NATO installation and so on. The second school is that NATO will go nuclear when the red line has been crossed. So if NATO is entering the deep crisis, there is a breakthrough in NATO's line and so on, then NATO goes for nuke. And the first school is the no one really wants it school. That's my school. And I think that probably nobody was going to voluntarily use nuclear weapons, no matter how desperate he was. And this is based on the fact that actually no one ever used nuclear weapons after World War III. And the idea of using them against an enemy that is well prepared to retaliate on an apocalyptic level actually doesn't make any sense to me.
Fabrizio, as Sting famously sung, the Russians loved their children too.
Exactly. That's it.
I really like that one. That's a good line from his album.
The one I liked was Ralph Peters' end to his book, which is when we were getting to the stage where NATO was considering it and the Germans surrendered. And that thought was, when that book, when it came out in 1989, I spoke to Ralph about it at the time, was just, compared to Team Yankee or anything written by Tom Clancy or whatever, all of a sudden, here were the Soviets who'd gone for it, they'd done this, that, and the other, and they didn't actually win, they were about to lose. And then the Germans changed their mind, and whack, all of a sudden, it was us and you driving back across the Rhine bridges, and that was the final page of the book, rather than see nukes turn Germany into an ashen barren waste again 30 years later.
That's what I liked what Coyle did in Team Yankee, was there was that limited nuclear exchange, and then both sides says, hold on, stop, time out, let's reconsider this, because
but the difference in Ralph Peters thought the unthinkable, which was he actually had Germany surrender and the Soviet Union won.
Yes. Yeah, that was a really good twist on things. Now, we have a question from Nick. He's saying, how about special operations in World War III? Mark was talking about how nukes would be used in rear areas. How does when it comes to using the Spetsnaz or U.S. Special Operations Forces in the rear areas, how would that be modeled?
I wrote a paper for a long time ago. It's called The First 3 Days, and it covers special operations, Soviet special operations at the beginning of a war, World War III. And one of the things I had fun with, besides, as I started alluding to, there was this enormous amount of, think about the 1st Armored Division's vehicles sitting in a very, very, very large set of parking lots. It's just sitting there. I mean, if you've ever seen pictures of it, you can see pictures of it. It's just tank, vehicle after vehicle, truck after truck. And the idea was the soldiers would fly to the equipment, but the equipment's just sitting there. And the idea that the Soviets were going to let them like drive to their tanks to get in them to go fight them was just kind of ludicrous in a lot of ways. And it's too hard to, it's very hard to guard. And so, we had all sorts of things with the Soviets had at that time, I think it was 7 airborne divisions, but they had they're slightly mechanized, they had these BMDs and all that kind of stuff. And so the idea was that they would use these drops to just, neutralize multiple divisions of equipment very quickly. But one thing I did have a lot of fun with, you all know, we've all played Battle of the Bulge games. And so I wrote this scenario where the North Vietnamese traded to the Germans, the East Germans, American equipment captured in Vietnam. And they created an Operation Grief, 150th Tank Brigade unit. And they put East Germans who spoke German in these, these tanks. And they drove up and, using the right language, captured the Rhine River bridges by driving 4 lines, using the right equipment, speaking German to Germans through the German Third Corps, and everybody loved that one. But I just stole it from the Battle of the Bulge.
So, Mark, why didn't you guys ever put these, going after these pumpkin sites? Because I have it in my game, and gamers hate it. They hate that you take Spetsnaz and attack these or airborne divisions and knock them out.
But you can.
Just to be clear, in 1978, this was an emerging concept. It wasn't a lot of it going on at that. It was just starting up then. Now, in 85, it was a big deal, but it wasn't as extensive in 78. You got to remember, I'm in the distant past of this story. You guys are talking about MLRSs and M1 tanks. None of that stuff existed. It was M68-3s and M113 combat vehicles, and it was very much a Korean War advanced kind of army fighting in 1978. Very different situation. Centurion tanks, not Challengers, that kind of stuff. So it's a different world. All that stuff was all like the XM1. It was called the XM1 one. It was not a real tank yet. And then there was the MLRS was the closest. They were starting to, they had Cobra attack helicopters, but they had those in Vietnam. So that's not like a new piece of equipment. So, the AH-64s and the Black Hawks, all that stuff comes later. So again, in 78, it wasn't as big a deal. Now I can see your point in the mid 80s. Yeah, there was a lot of that stuff, and, attacking the lines of communication and, the Northern Fleet coming down and interdicting the sea lines, Battle of the Atlantic would have been a big deal in this situation because, if you can't get those transport ships across, and you could fly the soldiers over the top. You can't bring in transport ships with ammunition and equipment. Europe's cut off from at least America. They make their own stuff.
If I may,
sure, go ahead, Tony.
I mean, if you look at actually let's start with our side first. NATO, what NATO SF was tasked for. I mean, there were certainly at the start of the 80s, and it slowly changed as kit changed, as things got better. Things like satellite communications that were portable and the guy could hold and all that. But it's stay behind parties in order to direct artillery because, the only drones that exist at the time fly out, come round, come back, land. You take the film out the camera, you develop it, you give it to a guy on a motorbike who drives to the staff officer who evaluates it and then radios a command through. N hours after, are they still there? You put a guy on the ground who lets the Soviets drive over him, sits and goes looking for a headquarters or a site or whatever. The drama you have, however, if we just look at 1990 and what they then ended up being used for in the desert during Desert Storm is the Great Scud Hunt. Because we know that, we've just talked about nukes and we haven't put gas in there, but it's the same. But you've got all those things going on. They're all going to end up being looking for these high priority targets. And all of a sudden, you actually will end up losing. So my view is on what you can use NATO type SF for is essentially providing targeting information that allows you to hit things at a greater depth than you might be able to because you can't see them with anything else. Because that's the role that they were asked to do. Mm-hmm. I think on their side, coming back to what Mark just said about, the North Korea, about Alex, North Koreans providing this, that, and the other, they existed for real. I mean, there were, East Germans in their East German SF in the Willi Zanger battalion who wore Bundeswehr uniforms, who had M113s and some M48s, and a few Iltis, and were supposed to do exactly that: drive through and protect. Now, it didn't work terribly well in the Bulge, and it probably wouldn't have worked terribly well in given the level of police, etc., that have been around. So I'm not sure that's great. But attacking Pomka's sites, perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Yeah, I think.
But Tony, that's only true if they didn't stop to buy bananas.
Well, I'll tell you what, when I was at Sandhurst, we were having a discussion about how do you stop the Russians, this, that, and the other, with John Keegan, who was my history professor at Sandhurst.
Oh, awesome.
Great man. And he turned around, and a chum of mine who went on to very, very laid-back British cavalryman turned around and he said, the answer to stopping them is terribly easy, sir. We just need to buy a lot of Gucci shoes and throw them in front of them. They'll be too busy bending over to pick them up. We'll just get on from there. No. Exactly that. Exactly that. Bananas and Gucci shoes. That's how you do it.
One statistic of the Cold War that just blows my mind. We of course look at the Cold War through our own lens, and it was a scary period where we were teaching our children how to take shelter underneath desks, but we forget how awful life was on the other side. After the Berlin Wall fell, the Honecker regime opened the gates along the Iron Curtain at the same time. And this is well known in Europe, but we don't think about it much in the US. In the next 72 hours, 1/4 of East Germany's population fled. That's not pack the bag, let's call our Aunt Eldritch and see if we can stay with her. That's, honey, grab the children, we're running. The pressure to get out of that gulag was unbelievable, and 1/4 of the population did it in 72 hours. Now, an awful lot of them, when they realized they were free, wandered back. But what a horrible place Eastern Europe was.
Oh, thank you.
Thank God that the Soviet Empire did fall, and that those, to me, the ultimate epitaph of communism is that NATO ended up going all the way to the Soviet border. And I think it's absolutely fascinating that Putin is beating his chest right now, saying no more NATO expansion. What NATO expansion? Our next objective, Moscow?
Well, there's also a comment here from Rob. He's saying that he thinks the overemphasis of refugees is a leftover mentality from World War II, with Germans fleeing from Soviets, which I simply don't think would have happened. And that kind of goes to what you were just talking about when the wall was, came down, the border was open, to how all those people left the country. But then they realized when they realized they were free, they'd kind of go back and forth. But thoughts on refugees in games? How are
the amount of planning effort that went in for real between the German authorities, the German police forces, the NATO authorities, that all the individual nations who had people in that layer cake on controlling route control to get troops forward and civilians out, because everybody expected the civilians to flee. Now, would they have done it? I think yes. I think you cannot. It's very easy to sit in 2120 and say, well, it's silly. This wasn't World War II. That wasn't. But actually, 1980 is closer to 1945 than we are to 1980. And the people who were sat in 1980, they were, if you were 45 years old, then, you were there. My mother-in-law remembers it all as a child. They had people who had flown from, East Prussia or whatever. Nobody wanted to meet the Red Army. Nobody wanted to meet the Red Army.
And not nuclear war and not poison gas. Yeah.
I had the second wife of my father was German, and I knew, as most of us probably, a lot of German at that time. And as Tony said, nobody wants to meet the Red Army. The refugees would have been a reality, a big reality to take into account. It's a must.
Yeah.
And there's a good point too. The refugee problem would depend on how much warning you give before the war starts, because if things started to escalate and it looked like it was going to, hey, this is ramping up, they're massing on the border, this is looking bad, we're going to get out of Dodge now. So that would play into it. But if there was a surprise attack, then you're going to deal with refugees at that point.
So Mo, let's go there, gentlemen. One of the great debates of the World War III era is, could they have surprised us? Thoughts?
Great question. Start with Mark.
I would tell you that I don't know if this was on air or before we started, but I used to see the NATO, when I was working in NATO in the late 80s, every morning they had the reports, and they were tracking things that you don't usually see in the newspapers. Where were the bridging equipment? Where was the mobile depots? The certain kind of supply units being brought up to full speed. That was the stuff. Even look at what Putin's been doing now. He's been building up for a year. Okay, I mean, there's no surprise that there's 100,000 Soviet, Russian troops sitting on the East Ukraine border. That's not a surprise. I mean, and it wouldn't have been a surprise then. Now, as you go further back in time, like you go back to the 70s, we didn't have the same level of space and drone and overhead flight capabilities that we do now. But right now, I mean, literally, you could buy a spot picture of that area of the world right now on commercially right now. I mean, you could look at it. I mean, it's just not that hard. There's just too much assets looking at that stuff. You're not sneaking 1,000 guys up on anybody. Now, whether they're actually going to go over the border or not, that's a different issue. But they're there, and could the Soviet frontline units have just picked up and gone? The answer is no. They got to bring up trucks with ammunition and gas, and there's just a bunch of things you got to do that you'd see, and beyond what you'd see in an exercise, or it wouldn't go very far. So no, I don't believe surprise. I could see as a standing start, but they wouldn't have been like what I call Pearl Harbor surprise. At least I don't think so.
I think what you have to do is define what you understand by surprise in this, and it was always there. It is. There used to be a phrase in NATO which was military usable warning time. So, in other words, it is the point at which the politicians finally accept that what Sakar and all the boys in all over, in all the countries everywhere, are turning on their politicians on all their morning briefs and going, they're doing this. We've now got indicators number 48, 49, 50, 122. We're way down the list. They're coming. Eventually, the politicians got to say, right, we agree with you. You can now start doing something. And that, from that point on, you have military usable warning. And the question, therefore, is actually a political question. It's how do you start your game politically? In things that I have run but have not published before, I have had political tables that run up that give you a variance to start each game that basically come out in the end and say, you got your full 48 hours, sucker, so NATO gets whatever it is, 2 game turns worth of pre-deployment. You got somebody out, you didn't get these out. What point does the guard get called up? What point is Queen's order in Parliament signed? It's when do the politicians make a decision that's the big question that has to be answered.
I agree with Tony, and the point, I think that the point is first, how you define surprise. I mean, I think that surprise is not waking up one morning and finding out that, the Russian invaded others during the night. That's not the concept of surprise. The concept of surprise is, as Tony said, the military time that you have at your disposal for putting up a reaction, and that's the real point. The second consideration I would like to make that is in most or practically every war in the past, there had been one or more than one episode where one of the sides had been taken completely or partially by surprise. And I think that no army, when it's planning a possible future conflict, is actually taking the possibility of being taken completely by surprise into real account. Most of the plans are drawn out thinking that some kind of time will be available, but that's not been the case in most of the war in the past. Sooner or later, you're got by surprise. I mean, for example, the classical example is the Ardennes offensive in 1944. I mean, we had the whole U.S. Army mobilized. You have aerial reconnaissance all over the area. You are already at war with Germany. And despite that, you are taken completely by surprise, with the Germans attacking in the same area where they took completely by surprise the French 4 years before. I mean, that's how war goes. Surprise is going to happen. I'm not saying that was going to happen for sure in a NATO Warsaw Pact conflict, but it's a possibility that cannot be ruled out. That's it.
And it also makes the games interesting, because if you want to just make it, the political posturing and everything leading up to it, it's nice to model that in there. It's actually, I think, a really great aspect to add into a game. But really, in the bottom line, it's like, for war gamers, I just want to get into it and start fighting. So you're as far as exploring the political escalation piece, if the player can't be active in determining that, and that's where Bruce has with his War of Nerves, scenario in NATO, it does try to give that feel to the gamer. And I think that's really important to have that. And then you're doing that now with, especially with Sacred Oil, you have that whole new aspect of it in the game where you're using just the first, map that's not even a game map. You're using the movement map, and you're using your pieces there and your cards and everything to escalate things up. And so you do model that, which is a nice change of pace based just on standard kinetic war. And it's great to have that. But in the end, I think wargamers just want to get in and start shooting tanks, like Mark was saying earlier.
So what other questions do we have from the audience?
Anybody else have, while I'm looking at these questions, anybody else have anything to add on that subject?
Only this. The Soviets had a logistics force of about 170,000 troops. They only had 50,000 of them actually deployed in peacetime. It was crystal clear that to get their logistics net up, 120,000 Russians, not even frontline Russians, these were logistics soldiers, had to come forward. And that would have been such an incredible tell to move that many soldiers forward just to get the logistics network to begin to start chunking. I don't think there was any military possibility that they could surprise us. And I think we're all agreeing with that. I think, Tony, you have the right of it. The real question would have been, would NATO have been too chicken shit? I mean, we all remember World War I, right? We immobilized and we caused the war. And I'm sure that memory would have gone through NATO's political structure. But if the military intelligence arms had been saying, hey, war is coming, their question really would have revolved on how quickly would NATO's political leadership have let the sword unsheath.
Well, Bart was asking your thoughts on a political reliability of East Germans, Poles, Czechs, etc. That's something that Mark had touched on earlier about how the cohesiveness of the Warsaw Pact would have not been there due to
What
the fact
about
that these
Italians,
countries would have held.
Turks, and Greeks?
Exactly. All these countries that would have not necessarily answered the call, so to speak. And I know, Fabrizio, you have the that modeled into Under an Iron Sky
Yeah.
in the 1985 series as well. So if you guys would like to talk about that here.
Yeah, I think that the reliability of the Warsaw Pact allies was questionable at best, and that's why we added rules for the possibility of Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary not joining the war or having serious internal unrest problems when joining the war. And probably from the Western point of view, we over-evaluated the monolithic compactness of Warsaw Pact for many years. But what happened in particular when the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe started to weaken gave us I think the real measure of the unrest and the insatisfaction of most Eastern Europe population toward the socialist, the communist regime. And I absolutely think that Soviet Union would have had several problems convincing the Western Warsaw Pact allies to join the war. And even when, for example, in the case of East Germany, the East German government would completely probably agree to join a war against NATO, the problem would have been the population itself, because it's completely not in agreement with what the government said, and it would be probably a mess. I think that Warsaw Pact had to expect at least one or two important defections among its ranks.
Adam, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, as I sort of mentioned, I think it cuts both ways. I mean, you got to talk Italians, Greeks, Turks. If you're going to talk Poles, and Bulgarians, and Romanians, and Yugoslavians. But I think gamers expect a model of unreliability. So I think I didn't really deal with it in Germany, but I deal with a lot in the Balkans and retrofitted back into Germany. And I honestly don't remember like who got the bad ratings. I know the Italians and Greeks and Turks aren't well rated, but I don't think the Poles and the Romanians and Bulgarians are well rated either, Czechs or East Germans. So I mean, you have to have it in there. It's part of the zeitgeist of the situation. But I do think we tend to focus on the unreliability on one side, don't really focus on the other side too much. Which I think the Greeks and Turks hated each other and were expecting them to fight together, and the Italians are possibly a mess. So sorry, Fabrizio. At least in the 80s, but I guess that's my viewpoint. More for zeitgeist reasons than anything else. But you got it.
Mark, your thoughts?
One of the things I liked, Dunnigan's Full the Gap game is that, again, that's much more, I guess it's more of a grand tactical game, but is the hidden unit values, that you don't know how good your units are until they bounce into somebody. And I think when I think about the Eastern Europeans, I think it would have been a mixed bag, more to the lower side of performance, but who knows, and I also think that the NATO side of it, people say, well, maybe NATO wouldn't have been so cohesive. Well, I think the difference would have been NATO was being attacked. See, when you're defending your homeland, you're a little bit differently, motivated than when you're attacking somebody else's homeland. So I think that NATO generally would have been more cohesive, just because you started it and you're going to overrun my house. Whether the East, whether the Hungarians or the Poles or whoever was going to be a really elite unit and all that would have probably depended on a lot of factors that would have varied from year to year, moment to moment. But I think ultimately this was going to be a Soviet show with the rear areas maybe would have been well covered by Warsaw Pact, but it was a Soviet show if they went. And the idea that you're going to have spearheads of East German units, I don't know. I mean, there's a reason why the KGB was all over East Germany. They didn't trust those guys, and they didn't trust any of those people, and those people didn't trust them. So not a lot of love there to begin with. So I don't think the Warsaw Pact was even half as reliable as some people would game it most of the time.
But Mark, I will say I did a lot of work in researching Berlin in 1985. I have a game coming out just on the city itself. Mm-hmm. And the East Germans are highly motivated there.
Yeah, but see, Berlin,
it's their show.
Yeah, see, but now we're talking about. I can agree with that because it's Berlin. But taking those East Germans and driving them into Paris, I mean, no, I don't think as much. And I think the East Germans.
I'm just saying the forces are pretty good. The East German forces that were allotted. Now this is, Stasi and the first motorized. Yeah, those are good units, but
that's not the motivation. The answer is once you leave Germany, now maybe reunification would, and that's what I would argue. I was sort of saying the East Germans might have been the best of the lot only because they would have been a reunification narrative you could have played on them. But I don't see how the Hungarians get excited about any of this.
There's nothing to be gained for them. They're not being attacked. They're just doing the grunt work.
Like I said, I can see the East Germans getting the reunification story, maybe. Berlin, reunited Berlin. I mean, I can see a whole bunch of those. That narrative might have worked for the East Germans. Don't know, but I don't see how the Czechoslovakians or the Hungarians, Romanians, Bulgarians, Poles would get all that excited about launching an attack on Paris. Just don't understand how what the motivation would be. Not saying it wouldn't happen. Maybe they would be a lot better than I'm saying, but even the Soviet writings that I've seen that have come out, they weren't that excited about it either. So it's not like just me talking.
I think it depends. I think so much that we talk about it depends upon exactly when you are talking about. As Fabrice mentioned in other contexts, and we've all mentioned in other contexts. If you're talking about 1968, you have a different view of life within Poland, within East Germany, within this, that, and the other. I mean, obviously, the Soviets did trust the Poles up until 1980 because they gave them a coastal front, allegedly, at least until 1980. In 1980, the Poles gave it back because internally they said, we can't support this anymore. I think, it's the same with the East Germans. I think up to about 1985, you're probably all right in suggesting that they were probably quite hard over. And interestingly, it's with them, it's not so much the reunification, it's almost the reverse of it. They always taught that there were two German-speaking states. That was the official teaching. It was all the way down. And their troop training, whereas the Soviet Union, the big bad guy was the US, and closely followed by the Bundeswehr, the East German army only taught the Bundeswehr, basically. They taught them that, these were people who needed liberating from nasty people. So it may have worked, but I think after 1985, that disappears because the country's starting to fall to pieces. So it depends when your game is set, when the game is set. Exactly that.
That was what I said earlier on. I'm talking about when I was looking at this. Remember, I was looking at this situation 75. From. I started working down there in 1979 on, and it evolved. But I will tell you that even by the mid 80s, I don't think the Germans were all that reliable. They were already starting to, I just don't think they were. Now, do I know that for a fact? Never happened. So you can postulate anything you want. But I don't think that the Warsaw Pact, and look how fast it fell apart, by the way. Remember 85 is Reykjavik, and by people. I used to ask my class in Georgetown, when did World War II end? And they gave the various normal answers of after the A-bomb, and all that. And the answer is 1987 is when the World War II ended. and the wall came down, reunification in 89, that's the end of World War II as far as I'm concerned, 1989. But you didn't get from 1985 to 1989 like dramatically. It was already eroding badly by 85. And when it happened, it snapped just almost overnight. The wall came down, and again, you had Gorbachev. He had no stomach for it. And I also think Gorbachev knew that they couldn't afford, nor could they even keep the Warsaw Pact together at that point. So 89, the whole thing fell apart very quickly. So to say that by 85 they were staunch, ready to go Germans, that didn't happen in 4 years. That was a lot. It was a lot of rot underneath the veneer. It's like particle board with a veneer of something that looks good on top, but as soon as you scratch it, you're down to particle board. It's not real wood. There's nothing really there. At least I think that in 78 it was probably better. I
would have their average year 75.
Okay, I could buy that 75. But remember, Next War is actually, even though we published it in 78, it was based on 75. We're getting unclassified stuff. It's like 75, 76 is the order of battle. So yeah, that's about right. Should I go?
I have a different. I have a slightly different perspective on this. Firstly, I actually minored in Soviet economics and deeply studied the Soviet Union at the level of economics and society since I was a child. I completely agree that the minor pact allies were unreliable at best and a direct threat at worst. The Warsaw Pact was designed to be a cage, nothing more. The structure of the Warsaw Pact was entirely run by the Russians. The concept was that every single division in Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia was a Soviet division commanded by a Soviet general that just happened to use the local prisoners of war as cannon fodder. So this was a Soviet system, and it was designed as much to make sure that if they needed to move tanks into Czechoslovakia or Poland, they could do it. And they used the inmates to keep the prison. I don't think there was any, I think the Soviets would have been extremely loath to actually use those troops in an offensive war. The second thing is, I don't believe that the Soviets ever intended to try and overrun the West. I think the Soviets were quite legitimately scared shitless of the West. They had been attacked by the West again and again and again, and we Americans forget that we had American troops on Soviet soil during the Civil War. Bottom line, I think it was entirely a defensive alliance, using the local inmates to keep the local inmates in check and to make sure that if the Soviet Union was attacked, there was a large armed buffer. I do not personally believe, despite the fact that I enjoy making these games and love the Cold War era, that there was any chance that the Soviets would have gone to an offensive war, with one critical exception. The lesson that the Soviet leadership had learned from Barbarossa was preempt. If they're coming for you, hit them first. Had the Soviets genuinely perceived that the West was going to do something that was a direct threat to the Soviet Union, I think that you might have seen them launch a surprise attack. But even there, from their own perspective, it would have been a defensive maneuver. Now, let's leave the politics aside for a second. Wargaming. I have strong feelings about this. I'm not going to ask a wargamer to spend an hour setting up a game and 4 hours playing it, only to have Poland turn. Like, okay, we rolled the Polish die roll. My 5-hour investment in this game is kaput because I can't get supplies across Poland. Game over. So from the perspective of designing a game, I find unreliability rules to be death by die roll, and I don't like putting players in a position of death by die roll. So my own approach to this has been the Soviets simply wouldn't attack if they didn't believe that whatever the current political situation was, that their allies would have solidly supported them, and that meant that the allies probably felt just as threatened as they did by whatever was going on in the West. But to have political unreliability rules in a war game makes it an interesting exercise in dice rolling, but an incredibly poor way to spend 5 hours of my life. Rant over.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today, and we still have a few questions in here. I'm going to see if we can pick out one or two of them real quick with really short answers from everybody here, because I want to let everybody get going here. I don't want to tie you guys up all day. Here's a question here. World War III games focus almost entirely on the first battle, and in nearly all cases end by D+30. Why is this? Do we know whether professional analysis was also limited in this time? So real quickly, do you think a World War III in these games in reality would have been ended this quickly? And obviously the games pretty much, your games all speak to themselves as far as how long you expect in your games by your game turns. Start off with Fabrizio.
Yeah, actually, most of the analysis and of the opinions on this agree on the fact that very simply not enough production of ammunition, replacement parts, tanks, anything to keep the conflict going for more than a limited number of days. The kill ratio on a modern battlefield is simply horrendous. Entire divisions could be wiped out in a matter of 24 to 46 hours. And and the production capability of both sides were not up to the task of keeping the conflict going for more than a few weeks. And after that, probably the conflict would have gone further in, but it would have been a completely different conflict with different weapons, with trench infantry. Could be, yeah, but not anymore a modern war on a modern battlefield. And that's it.
Okay, Adam, your thoughts?
Well, just quickly, I mean, you can only, I mean, you have to make the game have a reasonable length. It depends on your scale. I believe mine's 20 turns long. It's daily turns. So, I mean, you have to add more counters and all that. It becomes a practical exercise. To have it go too long, it depends on your scale. If I had a weekly game, game was a week a turn. I mean, possibly we could call it that. If the poster is actually asking like why we don't start the game 30 days in or something like that, it becomes a real exercise in bias at that point. I think where we think it'll go, it gets more and more off track. So I mean that's my only answer. I think you scale it to make it a reasonable game.
Makes sense. Bruce?
I'm firmly in Fabrizio's camp on this one. I think that a war on this scale would have been over in a matter of weeks. The pace of the fighting was just unbelievable. When you look at Adan's division going in on the morning of the third day there by the canal, and he goes in with 235 runners and he's got 35 running tanks at the end of the day. The scale of the destruction would have been unbelievable. Certainly my own simulation, NATO, it is set as a 14-day war. Usually one side or the other has run out of an army by the end of the first week. So I think that the decision would have been made very early. I agree with Tony. I think it would have gone to World War I after that. But essentially, that's it. Armistice occurs when one side has run out of an army and surrenders or digs in at that point, and whatever you got in those first couple of weeks is what you got. But assuming it didn't go nuclear, I think it's a very short war.
True, I agree. Mark, your thoughts?
Yeah, so just to say it, there's the commercial war gaming and it's like professional gaming. Professional gaming, what you realize is that the war goes in waves. Okay, if you don't believe if you don't get a decisive result somehow out of the first 30 days, what ends up happening is everything everybody says. The armies that initially clash are torn up, and you're out of bullets, and the supply lines are a wreck, and all those things become true very quickly because of all these munitions. But that doesn't mean the war ends unless So from a wargaming point of view, we evaluate victory and we're good. We shake hands and we start another day. But in the ones that I dealt with, that was really just the beginning of it. And so then the question is, who builds up munitions? And I don't mean World War One in the sense of you're digging trenches, although there would be a kind of a no man's land, but it is this issue that you have to then generate new forces, and that happens. And remember the United States, even in 1978, the United States economy was probably about 12 or 13 trillion dollars, and 2 trillion. You're saying?
No, well, our economy was double the size of theirs.
Yeah, but I'm talking about just the raw numbers. The United States had more than enough capability, and especially, in fact, I would say the United States manufacturing capability in 1978 is orders of magnitude better than what it is now. I mean, this was, the Rust Belt hadn't rusted yet. This is 1978. So we could make stuff in tremendous quantities. And even in the mid 80s, we still had a very large industrial base. That didn't come until globalization, and the real breaking down of internal manufacturing didn't happen until the 90s. So the United States' ability to produce another army and mobilize a big force and, more munitions and all that would continue. And unless the Soviets are going to start launching a strategic nuclear war to blow America off the face of the earth, and which we would have done the same to them, there's another army coming. And so how that goes from there, who knows? But the 30 days is sort of the fun gaming part. After that, it's a long, large national economies generating forces and sublimating commercial and you don't get refrigerators, you get tanks. That's kind of the thing. And the Soviets were geared to making tanks, not refrigerators, so they would have less to do to get to stay on that war economy. But all in all, it would be literally that next second and third and fourth wave of forces and munitions and all that. But the first 30 days is about how far these forces could go before they'd run out of juice, literally.
Tony, your thoughts?
I mean, I'm absolutely in complete agreement with Mark. I think it comes to a pause at 30 days. It either ends for nukes, it ends because one side gives up, or it goes into another industrial war, the third industrial war of the 20th century. And at which point, without a doubt, whoever is on the side of the United States is most likely to win it in 1978, without a doubt, or 1985. I mean, the only other thing I would add is that as the Cold War command system was winding up, there was the final exercise done in the Warrior Preparation Center was the North Ag staff versus the Centag staff. It was partly just for fun, but it was for various other reasons. And the then General Maddox got quite annoyed that North Ag, playing the golden side, as it was then called, as opposed to reds, had actually written down 3 USID by 70% in less than 12 hours using Soviet kit.
Wow.
Had lost more than they had, but that was the rate of loss that we were probably looking at going. You'd write a division off in the offensive within less than 24 hours.
Oh.
True. Well, that is going to do it for today. I mean, this conversation can go on for hours, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time and I really appreciate all of you for joining us today. Not only the audience, obviously, for joining in and chiming in with their questions and comments, but all of our esteemed guests here today. It's been great having Fabrizio, Tony, Bruce, Adam, and Mark here today to talk this subject, which is really just taken off so well. And we're so, I know us World War III wargamers are very happy to see the amount of games we've got now and the amount that we've got in the pipeline. So it's a great time to be a World War III wargamer. I'll say that.
Bring back the Cold War.
I think Mr. Putin is doing his level best to do that.
Very well.
Yeah, no, it is weird to see this happening again. I mean, we had that lovely peace dividend, that idea that, we could all go back to making refrigerators. And, I understand the internal politics. Putin desperately needs a short little war to restore some kind of internal popularity for a failing regime, but the long run impact of this is going to reignite NATO big time. And I think this is the stupidest thing the Russians could possibly be doing right now for very little real gain.
Well, great comment here that we've got from Milakok, I think is how you pronounce that. Thanks so much. Fascinating. All of you have given me a lifetime of a wonderful hobby. All the best. So that right there, I think, is the best comment you guys as designers could definitely hear, is that you've all provided so much entertainment for everybody. And you guys have, and you guys will continue to do so. And we look forward to the games that you've got in the pipeline, as well as revisiting all of the games that you guys have done in the past. And once again, thanks to everybody for joining us today. And thanks to all of our guests as well for being here. And you have been watching another of the ACDC shows. We still have a few more to go, and I hope you guys stick around and enjoy them. Thanks for tuning in,
thank
guys.
you very much for doing this.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, guys.
Thank you
Nice
very
to meet
much.
you all.
Have a
Take
great day.
care.
Good to see you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Adam, good to see you too.